All right, my friends, hopefully anagrams was not too bad. This is a rather challenging question. It is challenging, but it's also one that I can almost guarantee that you would see in an interview setting. So if you go on like 10 interviews, I would personally be kind of surprised if you didn't get asked this question. So it's definitely a very good one to keep in your back pocket because you never know when it's going to be asked. So let's talk about our solution here by using character maps. We're going to build a character map out of string A and string B, and then we'll compare all the characters inside those two maps together. So let's start off by giving ourselves a little bit of space inside this function. Now we're going to need to make a character map out of both of these things right here. So the first thing I'm going to recommend is we don't really want to build two for loops to iterate both through string A and string B. Instead, a really easy way to save ourselves the pain of having to write two separate for loops to iterate through each string right here would be to write a helper function to build a character map for us. Now, if you didn't make a helper function, if you wrote out two character map assemblies inside this function already, that's totally fine. But an interview setting, interviewers kind of like to see you create helper functions, and it kind of also allows you to better segregate or compartmentalize your code, which is always helpful inside of an interview. I have some other tips around creating helper functions that we'll talk about later on in the course. They're actually kind of a great thing to keep in mind in an interview setting. So let's first start off by making a helper function here. And we're going to use this helper function to build a character map for a given string. So we only have to write this logic one time, and then we can use it both on string A and string B. So we'll say function build char map, and we'll pass a string in to that function. Then inside of here, we'll create an empty object that will serve as our character map. We'll then iterate through our string, and for every character inside there, we will add it to our character map. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is that we had said that our string needs to be only considering lowercase characters, and we also need to strip out any spaces or any punctuation. So we certainly could do something like create a cleaned string ahead of time and do the regex and the two lowercase call right here. But one easier way of doing it, or maybe not easier, but a slightly more compact way, would be to tuck that kind of cleanup logic directly into the for loop itself. So let's look at what that might look like. We could say let char of string dot replace. So this is where we're going to do that replace and lowercase logic just right here in line with the for loop. So we will replace / square bracket caret \w, and then on the other side of the square brace we'll put a / g. So note that everything inside of your code editor should very likely turn into a slightly different color when you've got this regular expression put together correctly. So anytime that we find a character that is not a number, a character, a capital character, or a lowercase character, we want to replace it with nothing, or essentially an empty string. After we've done that cleanup logic, we'll then take the entire string and turn it to lowercase, like so. And then we'll open up our for loop. Okay, so now we're iterating only over the portions of the string that we really care about. And remember how we put our character maps together? We take our character map, we assign a key to the character map of the current character that we're looking at, and then we increment the value at that character. So we'll say char map at char is char map at char plus 1, and then we need to handle the case in which this particular character has not yet been assigned to the character map. So we'll say or 1, like so. And then very important, I can't stress this enough because when you're in a high stress setting, like an interview, or even when you're practicing these problems yourself at home, it's so easy to make tiny little mistakes. So I know it might be annoying for me to remind you all the time to get the return statements in here, but honestly, you have no idea how often people just honestly forget to put in return statements. So I will harp on that throughout the course. I apologize if that is annoying. Okay, so we've got our helper function here to build up our character map. Now we can use it to produce a character map for both string A and string B. So let's declare a variable, let's call it a char map, will be build char map from string A, and B char map will be build char map from string B. So we've now got these two character maps, and it's now up to us to compare the two of them together. The other thing that we still need to keep in mind is that kind of edge case that we mentioned at the end of the last video, where if we only compare this object to this one, we might miss out on some extra entries inside the second one. So I had mentioned that an easy way to solve this is to either compare the length of the two strings. If we do that, do remember that you would have to compare the length after subtracting out spaces and punctuation. So if you want to take that approach, you can do the same kind of replace and to lowercase for both strings up here, and then compare the length of the two of them. Another possible approach would be to look at the number of keys inside of both these maps and check to see if they are identical in length. So that is the approach that we're going to go with. So we're going to pull out all the keys from both these objects right here, and we'll count the number of keys that is contained in both. If you've never pulled out the if you've never pulled out the keys inside an object before, that's totally fine. I'll show you how to do that. Let's look at a quick example. So if we have an object that we'll call just obj, and it has keys A, B, and C, we can get a list of all the keys inside this object by calling object, notice that is a capital O, object.keys, and we'll pass an obj like so. So that returns an array with all the keys from our object. If we then call .length on that, well then we can very easily tell how many keys exist inside of our object. And so this is the solution that we're going to use to address this problem of some extra character existing in one character map or the other. So we'll get the number of keys inside this character map, the number of keys in this character map, and then can compare the two together. So in practice, we'll put a little if statement here. We'll say if object.keys for a char map .length is not equal to object.keys for b char map .length, well then we must know that we do not have an anagram because they have a different number of characters. Or maybe a better way of putting that would be to say one character map has an extra character type that the other one does not. So if that's the case, we will just immediately return false from this function. Now, if they do have the same number of characters, then we want to proceed with the map checking process, in which we will look at each one of these characters and compare the number of uses that it has to the other map. Now, this part might sound like it's kind of challenging. I know that when I kind of say that with words, when I put it into plain English, it sounds like it's something that's challenging, but honestly, I think you know how to do this. I think this is something that you definitely can do. What we have to do here is to iterate over one char map, look at every character inside of it, and then compare it to the other char map. So we're going to iterate over a char map, and really we could iterate over either one. It doesn't really matter here. We just have to pick one. In this case, we'll iterate over a char map. So we'll say for let char, and then don't forget here a little gotcha. If we are iterating over an array, we use of, but if we are iterating over an object, we use in. And remember that, what's the term for it? Not anagram. We're working on anagrams. I know it's going to come to me. The little trick for remembering which one to use, if we are iterating over an object, we use of, which is really confusing because object starts with O, so you would think that you would use of to iterate through an object, but that's not the case. So for an object, we use in, which is kind of doesn't line up with the first letter in that word right there. I know that's probably an awful way of remembering, but it's what I use. So we'll look through a char map, and if a char map at char is not equal to b char map at char, then something must be wrong. So let's say we're iterating through a char map, and the first character that we look at is the letter A. We say, how many times has A been used inside of a char map? If it has not been used the same number of times inside of b char map, that means that something must be wrong, or these two things do not line up at all. So in that case, we can immediately return false. Okay, now the last thing, and again, I know I'm harping on the return statements here, but this is another very easy one to forget. Notice how we set up here inside the directions that we need to return true if they are anagrams and false if they are not. So we've handled the cases in which they are not anagrams by specifically returning false. And then the thing that we cannot forget is that if we succeed in both these checks right here, that means that they must be anagrams. And so in that case, we should return true, like so. Okay, so this is our solution. This is solution number 1 for solving anagrams. Let's check our tests. It looks like they're all passing, which is fantastic. So I think that is going to work out just fine. Now, in the last video, I had mentioned that this whole anagram question and the 2 solutions that we're going to look at is kind of nice because it frames some later content that we're going to discuss in the course. So I want you to kind of look at this solution right here very quickly. When we look at it, you'll notice that if we consider the number of times that we have to iterate through either of these strings right here, we iterate through string A 1 time to build our character map. We iterate through string B 1 time to build our character map. And then we iterate through 1 character map to do the final comparison here. And so I just want to very quickly point that out because we are going to come back to this question or this solution right here later on in the course. And I'm going to just kind of point out some interesting things about the way that we solved this problem right here and the way in which we solve it in the next section, because we are going to look at a second solution. So with that in mind, let's pause right now. We're going to continue in the next video and we're going to look at another way of solving this problem that is far, far easier, but it does run into some interesting issues that, like I said, we'll kind of consider later on in the course. So quick break and we'll tackle that second solution in just a moment.